seen a surge in reports of corruption within the healthcare sector on the back of the COVID-19 pandemic. There were reports coming out of vaccine manufacturers even bullying governments. The High Court in Pretoria, though, has ruled in favour of civil rights organisations and has ordered, and this is important, they've ordered that all COVID vaccine contracts be made public, and it needs to be done within 10 days from last week's ruling. The Health Justice Initiative joining us this morning to give us their take on this, very important when it comes to transparency and accountability. The founder of the organisation, Fatima Hassan, joining us. Fatima, good morning to you. Appreciate the time. Just help those of us who don't quite understand why this is so very important to have these contracts made public. Help me understand. Good morning.
Good morning, Gareth, and thanks for having us on the show. So I think it's important for a number of reasons. The first and the most important being that in the procurement of health goods, particularly when you're using public funds, but critically in the middle of a global pandemic when supplies are scarce, that there needs to be transparency and accountability. And you can't measure transparency or accountability if you're dealing with blanket non-disclosure agreements or a total secrecy placed on all of these procurement contracts. Now, we as South Africans paid a lot of money. It's running into billions of rands for these vaccines. The supplies came to us very late or not at all, at a time when we were facing wave after wave after wave of COVID infections and different variants, and we were trying to mitigate that. So I think it's important for the public, and I think the judgment has affirmed that we have a right to know what's in those contracts, and the disclosure is definitely, as the court has said, in the public interest. And, critically, I think part of that is that a company can't come into South Africa, demand secrecy, demand very broad confidentiality clauses, and then use that as the basis not to disclose any part of the contract, or for our government to rely on those confidentiality clauses to insist that the contracts remain secret.
Yeah, I suppose some people could argue, though, Fatima, and I'm sure this probably came up in court arguments, or it certainly will be at least one of the criticisms, is what difference is it going to make now having this information? I suppose the fight should have really been when we were going through the pandemic. What does this really help us as a country to unpack it now?
Yeah, and unfortunately, we've been trying to get access to these contracts for the last 2 years. We used our access to information laws. We were rejected. Our appeals were rejected. And so we had no option but to actually approach the court. And that process takes some time. And I think that's a lesson for us going forward on the national health insurance as well as in the next pandemic, that there simply has to be a better system for proactive disclosure. It can't be civil society trying to take our government to court to order the disclosure of contracts, whether it's on health procurement, whether it's on energy procurement, whether it's on education procurement. I think, your question around why is it significant now, I think it's really essential for 3 reasons. One, we're going into an era of national health insurance where the state will be the sole procurer of most health goods, and they will coordinate that entire process. Secondly, there are global negotiations currently underway that deals with a pandemic treaty for the world in which to find a framework to respond to the next pandemic, which there will be one. And transparency is at the heart of those negotiations and is actually a sticking point in those global negotiations. And I think, thirdly, it creates a precedent for government to understand that they have a constitutional duty not to always defend the secrecy demanded by very powerful pharmaceutical companies who will be the main suppliers on the national health insurance as well.
I suppose the danger in something like this could also be, and we heard this during the more stringent stages of lockdown, is everything gets hidden behind this veil, behind this curtain of state of emergency and state of disaster, and those in the public just never seem to find out what that actually is. How does this change that, Fatima? Because if we start going that route every time government wants to hide something, you're going to spend the rest of your career in court, aren't you?
And I think that's part of the deal that civil society understands. That is our role, to use our constitution to the fullest. But we hope that a precedent can be created that even during a state of disaster, even during a public health emergency, that some of the minimum norms and principles around proactive disclosure have to be observed. That it could become a lesson for pharmaceutical companies that the next time you want full non-disclosure agreements or broad secrecy clauses inserted into those contracts, that there may be an override clause where if a court orders disclosure, that contract would have to be open. Our understanding, based on the hearing a few weeks ago, was when a confidentiality clause was actually handed up to the judge who requested it, there was in fact a clause providing that if a court ordered disclosure, that the confidentiality clause wouldn't be broken. So I think it was negotiated at a time where not just for South Africa, but many countries in the global south, like you said earlier, were bullied. And the demands from the pharmaceutical industry was so unreasonable that they basically traded limited supplies for secrecy. And that cannot be the situation that we're going to be facing this year or tomorrow or in the next few years. I mean, just this last week, Doctors Without Borders indicated that they were being asked to sign a non-disclosure agreement as a humanitarian agency with a leading pharmaceutical company on an HIV prevention drug, and they refused. So I think the precedent for transparency and accountability in pharmaceutical health procurement is really essential, and we really hope that the department cooperates and makes this information available within the time prescribed by the court.
I'm going to certainly get the thoughts of the Health Department, if not on this particular edition of the show, Fatima, possibly later in the day on the other shows or even tomorrow morning. But you're right, absolutely correct, the importance of the transparency and accountability. Yes, COVID, the lockdowns have come and gone, but it's more about how do we learn those lessons going forward, especially, and it's a good point you raised, around the NHI. This is why it's always good to speak to the experts to make sense of it for me. Fatima, I appreciate the time as always. Fatima Hassan, founder of the Health Justice Initiative. So all of those contracts during COVID-19 shrouded in secrecy. It looks like, however, that they're going to have to now open up the books, essentially, so we can see what those contracts look like.